6 cases of suspected airline pilot suicides. Pilot suicides are thankfully very unusual and are getting rarer, but they do happen sometimes, which ends in horrific results. Here are the 6 cases of suspected airline pilot suicides. Namibia, 29 November 2013. Mozambican Airlines Flight TM470 departed the capital Maputo scheduled for Angola on 29 November but crashed. According to the Civil Aviation Institute, the pilot made a, quote, deliberate series of maneuvers which caused the crash. The airline went down in severe rain in Namibia's Botswana National Park. The head of the Civil Aviation Institute, João Abreu, stated in a news conference that the pilot, Hermine dos Santos Fernandes, had a clear intention to slam the jet. The pilot locked himself in the cockpit and did not let his co-pilot inside until shortly before the plane hit the ground. Mr. Abreu said, "The cockpit voice recorder, CVR, displayed many oral warnings, as well as, quote, noises of recurrent knocking and calls, corresponding to attempts to get into the cockpit." Investigations also indicated that Dos Santos Fernandes manually altered the plane's altitude 3 times from 11,500 meters to 180 meters. He also changed the plane's speed. Namibian investigators reported that they observed, quote, no mechanical malfunction, end quote, that could have caused the crash. And the plane was one of the newest in the airline's fleet. Sadly, 33 people perished were passengers from Mozambique, Angola, Portugal, Brazil, France, and China. North Atlantic, 31 October 1999. The Egypt Air Flight 990 slammed into the Atlantic Ocean about 60 miles south of Nantucket, Massachusetts in the early morning hours of 31 October 1999. When the aircraft was crossing the ocean, the duty co-pilot vacated the cockpit, followed 8 minutes later by the captain. The relief co-pilot then removed the autopilot and, quote, nose-down inputs were recorded on the flight deck recorder, FDR, end quote. The aircraft then quickly nosedived after its engines were shut down. The pilot came back to the cockpit and tried to take control of the jet, repeatedly asking the co-pilot for aid, quote, but he continued to command the elevator to pitch nose down, end quote. The jet in the end collided with the surface of the ocean. The reasons that led the co-pilot to take these actions could not be determined, the report said. The crash killed all of the 217 passengers and crew on board. Botswana, 11 October 1999. On 11 October 1999, Chris Vatswe commandeered an Aeropostale ATR 42-320 from the Air Botswana section of the terminal at Sir Seretse International Airport and took off. For almost 2 hours, the pilot circled the airport, radioing the control tower and declaring his intention to kill himself. The airport was cleared as a precaution. Passengers later reported a good deal of panic in the terminal. Officials in the tower tried to persuade him to land. Efforts were led by General Tebogo Masir, then deputy commander of the Botswana Defense Force. Eventually, the aircraft began to run out of fuel, so Vatswe carried out a successful landing, but instead of surrendering to airport security, he began to maneuver towards the apron at high speed, crashing the plane into 2 other ATR 42s on the ramp. All 3 planes were demolished in a fiery crash, and Vatswe was killed. He was the only fatality. Indonesia, 19 December 1999. Silk Air Flight MI-185 was scheduled for Singapore from the Indonesian capital of Jakarta, but while on its way, it nosedived into the Musi River in South Sumatra, Indonesia, on 19 December 1999. While the aircraft was cruising at 10,000 meters, the flight recorders stopped recording. The airplane suddenly started to descend, and no Mayday message was transmitted before or during the descent. The aircraft collided with a river. The investigation ensued reported, quote, the safety investigation was not able to identify any technical problem, that would make it possible to explain the accident," end quote, and concluded that the crash was the consequence of deliberate flight control inputs, quote, "most likely by the captain." All 104 passengers and crew on board perished. Morocco, 21 August 1994. On 21 August 1994, Flight 630 was scheduled from Agadir, Morocco to Casablanca using an ATR-42 aircraft. Almost 10 minutes into the flight, while climbing through 16,000 feet, the plane entered a steep dive and slammed into a region of the Atlas Mountains. After an investigation, it was determined that the reason for the crash was pilot suicide. The captain disengaged the autopilot and intentionally directed the plane toward the ground. Quote, "The co-pilot was in the cockpit, but not able to counter the captain's actions," end quote. All of the 44 passengers and crew on board lost their lives. The crash was the deadliest ATR-42 crash then. Japan, 9 February 1982. Japan Airlines Flight 350 was a scheduled passenger flight from Fukuoka Prefecture to Tokyo in Japan. The cause of the crash was considered to be the pilot's deliberate crashing of the plane. After disengaging the autopilot on the final approach at a height of 49 meters, the pilot plunged the control column forward and set the thrust levers on idle. He then proceeded to the thrust levers of engines 2 and 3 to the reverse idle position. As the aircraft plummeted, the co-pilot tried to pull on the control column, but he wasn't capable of raising the nose of the airplane because the captain, quote, "was pushing forward on the control column with both hands," end quote. The aircraft collided into the sea 510 meters short of the runway. An investigation indicated that the actions of the pilot resulted from schizophrenia. Of the 166 passengers and 8 crew, 24 died.